A scream pierces the frozen air of Bletsoe Castle, sharp and raw, cutting through the howling wind like a blade slicing silk. It's a winter night in January 1457. And the stone corridors of this Bedfordshire stronghold amplify every sound, carrying the agony of a 13-year-old girl to every corner of the ancient keep. In a chamber lit only by the flickering glow of tallow candles, Lady Margaret Beaufort grips the blood-soaked sheets beneath her small frame racked with pain no child should ever endure. The midwives, their faces etched with worry, murmur Latin prayers, their voices blending with the crackle of the fire and the relentless storm outside. Snow blankets the fields beyond the castle walls, turning the world silent and white. But inside this room, the air is thick with heat, fear, and the metallic tang of blood. Margaret's sweat-drenched hair clings to her pale face as another contraction seizes her, her body convulsing under a burden it was never meant to bear. At 13 her hips are too narrow, her frame still that of a girl not yet grown, yet here she labours to bring forth a child who will one day claim the throne of England. As Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, the scene is almost unbearable to imagine a child giving birth to a child, her body pushed to the brink of death in a world where dynastic ambition outweighs human compassion. The midwives exchange glances heavy with meaning, their hands moving with practiced urgency as they try to guide the baby into the world. The castle's physician, Dr. Lewis Carlion, hovers nearby, his learned mind racing through the texts of Hippocrates and Galen, knowing that all his knowledge might not be enough to save both mother and child. Outside, the wind moans, rattling the leaded windows, as if the very elements mourn the suffering within. Margaret's mother, the formidable Margaret Beauchamp, stands at the edge of the room, her face a mask of stoic resolve. Though her clenched fists betray her terror, she had been 18 when she bore Margaret, old enough to survive the ordeal. Her daughter, barely past childhood, faces a trial that has claimed countless women stronger and older. This is no ordinary birth, and Margaret is no ordinary girl. Her veins carry the blood of kings, tracing back to John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, fourth son of Edward III. That royal lineage, a golden thread in the tapestry of her life, marks her as both a prize and a target in the brutal political landscape of 15th century England. The Wars of the Roses, though not yet named, are beginning to cast their shadow. A conflict that will tear the realm apart with rival claims to the throne. Margaret's child, if it survives, will be born into this maelstrom, a potential heir to the Lancastrian cause, a beacon of hope or a magnet for danger. The irony is not lost on those in the room. This infant, torn from a girl's broken body, will one day end the bloodiest civil war in English history and reshape the nation's future. To deepen the weight of this moment, consider the world beyond the castle walls. In 1457, England teeters on the edge of chaos. The 100 Years' War has drained the kingdom's coffers and pride, with English territories in France slipping away like sand through clenched fists. King Henry VI, a pious but weak ruler, struggles to hold his fractious nobles together, while whispers of Yorkist ambition grow louder. The birth of a male heir to the Tudor line, tied to the Lancastrian cause through Margaret's blood, is not just a personal triumph but a political earthquake. The midwives, though focused on their task, know this. The servants, screaming with basins of hot water, feel it. Even the storm seems to howl with the knowledge that history is being forged in this blood-soaked chamber. Margaret's screams grow weaker as the hours drag on, her small body exhausted but unyielding. The candles burn low, casting long shadows that dance like spectres on the stone walls. The midwives work with grim determination, their hands slick with blood and sweat, knowing that every moment brings mother and child closer to life or death. This is the crucible where a dynasty begins, where a girl's suffering will birth a king, the story of Margaret Beaufort, a woman who will navigate treachery, loss, and exile to place her son on the throne. Starts here in a room filled with pain and prayer on a night when the wind itself seems to weep. Before we plunge deeper into the harrowing tale of Margaret Beaufort and the birth that shaped a dynasty, let's pause for a moment to connect across time. If you are captivated by these hidden stories of history, tales of sacrifice and survival that echo through the centuries, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that brings the past to life. Drop a comment below to share where you're listening from. It's remarkable to think we're exploring these ancient narratives together, united by a shared curiosity, from bustling cities to quiet corners of the world. Now, let's return to the 15th century, where a girl's royal blood defined her destiny in a realm on the brink of chaos. Margaret Beaufort was no ordinary noblewoman. Even at 13, her veins pulsed with the legacy of kings, a direct descendant of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, fourth son of Edward III. This lineage was a double-edged sword, a shimmering badge of honor that marked her as a prize in the deadly game of medieval politics. In the 1450s, England was a tinderbox, its nobility fractured by ambition and rival claims to the throne. The Lancastrian king, Henry VI, sat uneasily on a throne coveted by the House of York, whose own claim traced back to Edward III's second son. Margaret's blood tied her to the Lancastrian cause, making her both a valuable asset and a dangerous liability. To be of royal descent was to live under constant scrutiny, where every marriage, every child, could shift the balance of power. To understand the weight of her lineage, imagine the court of 1457 as a chessboard, each piece moving with calculated precision or reckless ambition. John of Gaunt's blood was a currency of power, but it came with a price. Margaret was not just a girl, she was a potential queen mother, a vessel for dynastic hopes, or a target for those who saw her as a threat. The Wars of the Roses, though not yet fully ignited, were simmering. Noble families aligned themselves with either the red rose of Lancaster or the white rose of York. And neutrality was a luxury few could afford. Margaret's very existence was a political statement. Her future bound to the fortunes of her house. Her childhood, though brief, was steeped in this awareness. Born in May 1443 at Bletsoe Castle, she was the daughter of John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. The Beauforts were legitimized bastards, descendants of John of Gaunt's illicit union with Catherine Swynford. Later sanctified by marriage and royal decree, this legitimacy was a fragile thing, questioned by rivals who saw the Beauforts as upstarts. Yet their proximity to the throne made them indispensable to the Lancastrian cause. Margaret grew up in a world where whispers of treason were as common as morning prayers, and where a girl's value lay not in her heart, but in the alliances her blood could forge. To enrich this portrait, consider the cultural backdrop of her early years. The 1440s were a time of fading chivalric ideals, eroded by the brutal realities of war and betrayal. The 100 Years' War had left England humiliated, its dreams of continental glory shattered. At court, poets still sang of Arthurian romance, but the reality was a gritty struggle for power. Margaret, even as a toddler, was surrounded by tutors and priests who instilled in her the duties of her station. She learned to read Latin, to embroider with precision, and to carry herself with the dignity of a future queen. Yet she also overheard the hushed conversations of her mother's advisers, discussing battles lost in France and the growing unrest at home. Her bloodline, a source of pride, was also a chain binding her to a destiny she could not escape, as we stand on the threshold of Margaret's story. The image of that 13-year-old girl in labor at Bletsoe Castle looms large. Her suffering was not Just personal but symbolic, a microcosm of the pain and ambition that defined her era. The child she bore would carry the weight of her lineage into a future she could scarcely imagine, a future where the red and white roses would clash in blood. But to understand how she reached that birthing chamber, we must step back to her earliest years, to a world where her father's disgrace and death cast long shadows over her childhood, shaping a girl who would become one of history's most formidable women. Margaret Beaufort's path to that fateful birthing chamber began in the spring of 1443 at Bletsoe Castle, a sturdy fortress in Bedfordshire that had stood sentinel over the English countryside for Genotti. Hans, born to John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. She entered a world already scarred by the endless grind of the 100 Years' War. England's once glorious campaigns in France were crumbling, and her father stood at the heart of that decline. John Beaufort had commanded English forces during the final, desperate phases of the conflict, watching helplessly as territories won by the legendary Henry V slipped away like ghosts in the dawn. The defeats were not just military. They were personal humiliations that gnawed at his soul, leaving him a shadow of the proud warrior he had been. The war had begun with such promise. A century earlier, fueled by Edward III's claim to the French throne, but by the 1440s, it had devolved into a series of costly failures, draining England's resources and morale. John's campaigns in Normandy and Anjou were marked by sieges that dragged on without victory, ambushes that decimated his troops, and alliances that fractured under pressure. Chroniclers of the time described him returning from France with hollow eyes and trembling hands, his once commanding presence reduced to whispers and isolation. He spoke little, ate less, and spent hours staring into the void, haunted by the ghosts of fallen comrades and lost lands. The court buzzed with rumors. Was it the weight of failure, or something more sinister, like a curse from the French sorcerers or poison from rivals envious of his Beaufort blood? On May 27, 1444, barely a year after Margaret's birth, John Beaufort was found dead in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official cause was fever, a common enough affliction in those plague-ridden times. But those closest to him whispered darker truths. Some said he had taken his own life, driven to despair by the military disasters that had stained his honor. A blade to the wrist, perhaps, or a draught of hemlock swallowed in the dead of night. Suicide was a mortal sin, but dishonor was a living hell. Others murmured of poison, for in the treacherous world of 15th century nobility, unexpected deaths were often laced with intrigue. Rivals at court, Yorkist sympathizers, or even agents of the French crown could have slipped something into his wine, turning his grief into a convenient elimination. The ambiguity of his death lingered like a fog over Margaret's early years, a mystery that fueled her later obsession with control and survival. The impact on young Margaret was profound. Though she was too small to remember her father, his absence created a void filled with stories of his valor in battle, his descent from kings, and the scandals that shadowed the Beaufort name. Her mother, the indomitable Margaret Beauchamp, wasted no time mourning. Survival in this era demanded action. As a widow with a valuable heiress, she understood that women and children were pawns in the grand game of alliances. The Beaufort estates were rich, but vulnerable without a male protector. And the whispers about John's death only heightened the dangers little Margaret grew up hearing. Tales of her father's campaigns, not as bedtime stories, but as lessons in the fragility of power. The court's vultures circled, ready to pick at the remains of disgraced families, and poison, real or metaphorical, followed every shadow to add layers to this tragedy. Consider the broader social context. Suicide in medieval England was not just a personal act but a familial stain, denying the soul salvation and the body a Christian burial. If John had indeed ended his own life, It would have been concealed at great cost, perhaps with bribes to priests and falsified records. Poison, on the other hand, evoked the era's paranoia about alchemy and betrayal. Where even trusted servants could be assassins, these rumors shaped Margaret's worldview, instilling a wariness that would serve her well in the cutthroat politics ahead. By the time she was toddling through Bletsoe's gardens, playing amid the blooming roses that would one day symbolize civil war, she was already marked by loss of father gone, a legacy tainted, and a future dictated by the ambitions of others. In the wake of John Beaufort's mysterious death, his widow, Margaret Beauchamp, understood with chilling clarity the precarious position of a noble woman alone in a world ruled by men and ambition. The Dagger Duchess, as some called her for her sharp mind and unyielding resolve, moved swiftly to secure her daughter's future. In 15th century England, where widows could be stripped of lands and children wardenship granted to rivals, survival meant forging alliances before grief could take root. Beauchamp navigated the court with the precision of a master chess player, petitioning King Henry VI for guardianship of her infant daughter and the Beaufort estates. Her efforts paid off. She retained control, but the victory was bittersweet, shadowed by the knowledge that little Margaret's royal blood made her a glittering prize in the marriage market. By the tender age of 6, Margaret found herself betrothed to John de Lawpole, son of William de Lawpole, Duke of Suffolk. The contract was inked in 1449, binding two of England's most powerful families in an alliance that promised stability amid the growing whispers of discontent. Suffolk was the king's favourite, a man who had risen from merchant stock to wield immense power, negotiating peace treaties and amassing wealth that rivaled the crown's. The betrothal was celebrated with quiet pomp at Bletsoe Castle, where young Margaret, dressed in silks embroidered with the Beaufort arms, exchanged vows she could barely comprehend. She played in the gardens afterward, oblivious to how this union positioned her as a linchpin in Lancastrian strategy, her small hand signing away her childhood to the demands of statecraft. But politics in this era shifted like storm clouds over the English Channel, swift and unforgiving. Suffolk's fall from grace came in 1450, triggered by his role in the disastrous marriage of Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou, surrender of Maine and Anjou to France. These concessions enraged the nobility and common folk alike, who saw them as betrayals that hastened England's humiliation in the 100 Years' War. Accused of treason, Suffolk was banished, but his enemies ensured he never reached safety. While crossing the Channel, he was intercepted by what some called pirates, others political assassins. Dragged aboard their ship, he was forced to kneel on the gunwale, his head struck off with a rusty sword in half a dozen clumsy blows. The brutality shocked even a hardened age. His severed head and body dumped on Dover's beach as a warning to those who rose too high. The murder shattered the de Lawpole alliance, rendering Margaret's betrothal worthless parchment. At 7 years old, she learned the fragility of promises in a world where power could evaporate overnight. Her mother, ever the survivor, adapted with ruthless efficiency, dissolving the contract through papal dispensation and seeking new protections. This event underscored the political instability roiling England, the weak rule of Henry VI, the simmering resentments over lost French lands, and the rise of Yorkist factions under Richard, Duke of York. Families like the Beauforts walked a knife's edge, where a patron's death could spell ruin, to evoke the ear's tension. Imagine the court as a shadowed hole, where smiles hid daggers and every whisper carried the scent of conspiracy. Suffolk's gruesome end was a harbinger, a bloody punctuation mark on the fading peace, propelling Margaret toward her next fateful union. The dissolution of Margaret's first betrothal left her once again a pawn in the relentless game of noble alliances, but her mother wasted no time in arranging a new match that would bind her even closer to the Lancastrian crown. The next suitor was Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI through his mother's clandestine marriage to Owen Tudor. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts, their legitimacy a matter of royal whim rather than ancient pedigree. But they possessed what mattered most in these turbulent times, the king's favour. Owen Tudor, a dashing courtier, had captured the heart of Catherine of Valois, widow of Henry V, in a secret union that scandalized the nobility. Their sons, Edmund and Jasper, were acknowledged by Henry VI, elevated to earldoms and woven into the fabric of Lancastrian power. Edmund, in his mid-20s, was a seasoned warrior and politician. His dark Welsh features and commanding presence a stark contrast to the child he would wed. In 1455, when Margaret was approximately 12 years old, the marriage was solemnized at Bletsoe Castle, the same ancestral home where she had spent her innocent childhood days wandering the gardens and dell. Earning her letters, the great hall was adorned with tapestries depicting the heroic deeds of her Beaufort ancestors, their woven figures gazing down as if judging the union. The chapel, where vows were exchanged, housed the tomb of her grandfather, John Beaufort, Earl of Somerset, his sombre reminder of the bloodline's burdens. Margaret, dressed in a gown of crimson and velvet embroidered with golden lions, stood before the altar with a composure that masked her inner turmoil. The words of love and fidelity she recited were foreign concepts to her young mind, promises extracted by the cold calculus of politics rather than affection. Edmund, tall and armored in velvet doublet, placed a ring on her finger, his touch firm and possessive, sealing a destiny that stretched far beyond the stone walls of Bletsoe. The ceremony itself was a blend of splendor and solemnity, with priests intoning Latin prayers under the flickering light of beeswax candles. Guests from noble houses feasted on roasted venison and spiced wine, toasting the alliance that strengthened Henry VI's hand against Yorkist threats. Yet beneath the revelry lurked the era's harsh realities. Marriages among the nobility were tools of statecraft, consummated without regard for age or maturity. There was no notion of waiting for a physical readiness. Noble girls were viewed as broodmares for dynastic ambitions, their bodies sacrificed to produce heirs. For Margaret, the wedding night unfolded as a trauma she would never openly discuss, its shadows lingering in her lifelong devotion to faith and her obsessive piety. The chamber, warmed by a roaring fire, became a place of violation, where her child's body was claimed by a man twice her age. The pain and confusion of that night etched deep scars, transforming innocence into a guarded resilience that would define her, to deepen the emotional resonance. Consider the cultural norms of the time, where canon law permitted marriages at 12 for girls, viewing them as vessels for lineage rather than individuals with rights. Chronicles hint at the psychological toll, with many young brides retreating into religion as a sanctuary from marital duties. Margaret's experience mirrored countless others. Yet her royal blood amplified the stakes. Her womb was a battlefield for England's future. The consummation was immediate and insistent, driven by Edmund's need for an heir to solidify the Tudor claim. In the dim light of the bridal bed, hung with heavy curtains to ward off draughts, Margaret endured what society demanded, her silent tears soaking the linen pillows. This night not only robbed her of childhood, but planted the seeds of a pregnancy that would test her limits, forging a woman whose strength was born from suffering. As dawn broke over Bletsoe, casting golden light on the frost-kissed fields, Margaret awoke to a world forever changed. The marriage bound her to a man whose loyalties lay with the crown, but whose Welsh roots evoked ancient myths of dragons and destiny. Edmund treated her with a paternal affection, perhaps, but the power imbalance was profound. She learned quickly to navigate his expectations, her sharp mind absorbing lessons in courtly manners and political nuance even as her body adjusted to its new role. This union, though brief, would propel her into widowhood and motherhood, setting the stage for the extraordinary path ahead, a path marked by loss, ambition, and an unyielding will to protect the child she carried. Within months of her wedding to Edmund Tudor, Margaret's young body began to betray the secret growing within her, changes that stirred a whirlwind of terror in her child's heart. The older women in her household noticed first the subtle rounding of her belly, the pallor that crept into her cheeks, the bouts of nausea that left her retching into a basin before dawn. They spoke in hushed tones, their words a mix of forced joy for a potential heir and grave concern for a mother so perilously young, at 12, soon turning 13. Margaret was thrust into a role her frame was ill-prepared to handle. Her hips still narrow from girlhood, her strength untested by the rigors of adulthood. The pregnancy unfolded like a storm-gathering force, each day bringing new aches and fears that she confided only to her prayer beads and the shadowed corners of her chamber. Margaret's own mother, Margaret Beaufort, watched this transformation with a knot of anxiety twisting in her gut. Having borne her daughter at 18, she knew the perils of childbirth all too well, the tearing pain, the feverish aftermath, the spectre of death that hovered over every laboring woman. Now, seeing her child endure the same at such a tender age, her worry bordered on despair. She hovered like a guardian spirit, ensuring Margaret ate nourishing broths laced with herbs like nettle and raspberry leaf to strengthen the blood, and consulted midwives who prodded and measured with knowing nods. Yet beneath her practical actions lay a deeper torment, the guilt of having arranged this marriage, the helplessness against a society that viewed noble girls as mere conduits for power. In this era, daughters of high birth were political currency, their wands bartered for alliances, their innocence sacrificed without a second thought. Chronicles of the time recount similar tales. Girls wed at 10 or 11, bedded immediately, their small bodies broken by the demands of dynasty building. Margaret was no exception. Her pregnancy was celebrated as a triumph for the Tudor line, even as it endangered her life. The physical toll mounted swiftly. Margaret's limbs swelled, her back arched under the unfamiliar weight, and sleep evaded her as the baby stirred within. A constant reminder of the night that had planted this seed. Fear gnawed at her, amplified by the women's tales whispered during sewing circles, stories of labors that lasted days, of babies too large to pass, of mothers who bled out on the birthing stool. She turned to her faith for a solace, clutching a small ivory crucifix, murmuring prayers to the Virgin Mary, who had borne a child in divine grace. But human grace was scarce. The societal norms that propelled her into this state offered no reprieve. Noble marriages were consummated without delay to secure heirs and prevent annulments, a custom rooted in feudal law and the ceaseless quest for legitimacy. Edmund, ever the dutiful husband, had claimed his rights immediately, leaving Margaret to grapple with the consequences alone as he rode off to attend to his estates and the king's business. To illuminate the emotional depths, imagine Margaret stealing moments in Bletsoe's chapel, her knees pressed to the cold stone floor, begging for strength. The flickering candlelight cast her shadow long and wavering, much like her future uncertain, fraught with peril. Her mother's anxiety manifested in sleepless vigils, pacing the halls, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios drawn from her own experiences and the grim statistics of the time, where childbed fever claimed 1 in 5 women. This pregnancy was a crucible, testing not just Margaret's body, but her spirit, forcing her to confront mortality before she had fully grasped life. The women round her, from maids to midwives, treated her with a strange deference, their eyes reflecting both awe for the potential heir and pity for the child who bore him. In their care, Margaret found fleeting comfort, but also a stark reminder of her isolation, her fate tied to a child she might not live to hold. The cultural backdrop amplified her dread. In 15th century England, Medical knowledge was a patchwork of ancient texts and folk remedies, with midwives relying on herbal lore and prayer rather than science. A noblewoman's pregnancy was a public affair, scrutinized for its political weight. Yet Margaret's youth made her a curiosity and a cautionary tale. Her condition was discussed in hushed corridors, from Bletsoe's halls to the royal court, where Lancastrian supporters saw her as a vessel for their hopes. While Yorkist spies noted her vulnerability, the weight of these expectations pressed harder than the child within her, each kick a reminder of the dynasty she was expected to secure, as summer faded into autumn, and her body grew heavier. Margaret's prayers grew more fervent, her small hands tracing the beads of her rosary, seeking courage from a God who seemed both near and impossibly distant. But Edmund Tudor would never witness the birth of his child, nor hold the heir whose conception had come at such a cost to his young wife in the autumn of 1456. While campaigning in Wales against encroaching Yorkist forces, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle, a formidable stronghold that had long guarded the western marches of the realm. The circumstances of his seizure remain shrouded in the mists of civil strife and intrigue, a tapestry woven with threads of betrayal and bad fortune. Some accounts paint a picture of a surprise assault, his troops scattered across the rugged Welsh landscape, caught off guard by a swift Yorkist raid under the cover of twilight. Others whisper of treachery from within his own ranks, a Judas among his men who opened the gates for silver or promises of favor. The Wars of the Roses were breeding grounds for such duplicity, where loyalty could be bought and sold like cattle at market. And Edmund's Welsh heritage made him a target for those who resented the Tudors' rapid rise. Imprisoned in the dank cells of Carmarthen, Edmund's fate hung by a thread, whether he succumbed to the plague, that ever-present scourge of medieval prisons with their fetid air and vermin-infested straw, or met a more sinister end at the hands of his captors. History offers no clear verdict. The official narrative leaned toward disease, a convenient explanation that absolved his jailers of regicide, since murdering the king's half-brother would invite royal wrath. Yet contemporary chroniclers noted the unnatural haste of his decline, the refusal to allow physicians entry, and the suspicious silence from those who guarded him. Poison, perhaps slipped into his meager rations, or a quiet dagger in the night. These rumors swirled like smoke from a hidden fire. Edmund lingered for mere weeks, his body wasting away until November 3rd, 1456, when death claimed him at the age of 26. His passing was not just a personal loss, but a political tremor, stripping the Tudor line of its head and leaving a pregnant widow exposed in a kingdom sliding toward open war. The news reached Margaret at Lamheath Palace in Pembrokeshire, where she had sought refuge while her husband waged his campaigns. It arrived on a rain-lashed November evening, the messengers hoarse-foaming with exhaustion from the frantic ride across storm-swept Wales. Margaret was in the palace chapel, her swollen belly making every movement a labor. As she knelt in prayer for Edmund's safe return, the echo of the messenger's boots on the flagstone shattered the sanctity, and she knew, with a mother's intuition sharpened by fear, that her world had fractured irreparably before he even spoke. At 13, she was a widow, heavy with child, and utterly alone in a landscape where enemies lurked in every shadow. The grief struck like a physical blow, compounding the isolation of her pregnancy with the sting of abandonment. She collapsed against a pew, her hands cradling her unborn child as sobs racked her frame, the future now a void filled with uncertainty and peril. In this moment of despair, Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother and a steadfast Lancastrian, stepped forward as her protector. His decision was born of chivalry and pragmatism. Margaret carried the potential continuation of the Tudor bloodline, a spark that could ignite Lancastrian hopes amid the gathering darkness. Jasper, at 25, was a warrior forged in the same fires as his brother. his Welsh roots granting him a network of loyalists in the principality. He spirited her way to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle, a move that blended compassion with strategy. Margaret, numb with loss, accepted his aid, recognizing in him a kindred spirit bound by blood and cause. The transition marked the beginning of a bond that would endure decades of turmoil, with Jasper becoming not just a guardian, but a mentor in the arts of survival. As she left Lammy behind, the rain mirroring her tears, Margaret steeled herself against the storms ahead. Her widow's weeds a cloak for the fierce determination awakening within. To heighten the emotional stakes, envision the cultural weight of widowhood in 15th century England, a status that stripped women of autonomy, rendering them vulnerable to predatory guardians or forced remarriages. For Margaret, so young and expectant, it amplified the terror of an uncertain birth, her child's legitimacy now her only shield. Whispers of foul play in Edmund's death fueled her paranoia, teaching her early the value of vigilance in a world where plague could be a euphemism for poison, and loyalty a fleeting illusion. The journey to Pembroke Castle was an ordeal that tested Margaret's fragile state to its limits, a grueling trek through the heart of winter that amplified her grief and physical discomfort. Pregnant and widowed, she travelled in a horse-drawn litter. The wooden frame jolting over rotted paths froze and solid by unrelenting frost. What should have been a 2-day ride stretched into 5 agonizing days. As the party navigated swollen rivers turned to ice and skirted bands of armed men whose allegiances were as unpredictable as weather, snow flurries whipped at the curtains of her conveyance, seeping cold into her bones, while each bump sent waves of pain through her swollen abdomen. Jasper Tudor rode beside her, his face set in determination, ensuring their small escort remained vigilant against Yorkist patrols that roamed the Welsh borders like wolves scenting prey. Pembroke Castle loomed on the horizon like a sentinel from another age, perched dramatically on a limestone outcrop above the Pembroke River, its massive stone walls defying the Atlantic gales that battered the coast. Built in the 11th century and expanded over generations, it was a fortress designed for survival rather than comfort, dominating the landscape from miles with its great round keep soaring nearly 80 feet high. This bastion had withstood sieges, storms, and the march of time, its battlements scarred by history's tempests. Inside, the chambers were draughty caverns where wind whistled through cracks in the ancient masonry, and great fireplaces roared day and night, consuming logs faster than servants could hold them. Margaret's rooms were hung with thick tapestries depicting biblical scenes and chivalric tales, a feeble barrier against the chill that formed ice on the inside of the leaded windows. The winter of 1456 to 1457 was particularly savage, with blizzards howling off Milford Haven, turning the world outside into a white void where the crash of waves against the cliffs below echoed like dust and thunder in this remote Welsh refuge. Margaret's condition drew increasing alarm from those charged with her care. Dr. Lewis Carlion, the castle's physician, a man schooled at the universities of Oxford and Paris, with decades of experience drawing from the wisdom of Hippocrates, and Galen examined her with growing concern. His probing hands and grave expression revealed truths she dreaded. Her hips were too narrow, the legacy of a body still caught between girlhood and womanhood, and the baby was positioned awkwardly, its head not descending as it should, in whispered conferences with Jasper in the castle solar. As snow swirled beyond the arrow-slit windows, Carlion was blunt. He had seen such cases before, and they seldom ended well. Turning the child risked immediate death for both. Waiting might exhaust Margaret beyond recovery. A caesarean, rare and barbaric, was almost certainly fatal to the mother. The air in those meetings thickened with tension. The physicians learned tomes offering no miracles, only stark probabilities. Jasper, at 25, bore the weight of these decisions like a crown of thorns, his affection for his brave sister-in-law clashing with the political imperative of preserving the Tudor heir. If Margaret perished, the line ended. If the child died, the same void yawned, yet in her presence. He masked his fears, offering words of encouragement that rang hollow against the castle stone echoes. Margaret, barely able to walk the length of her chamber without fatigue, sensed the peril but clung to her burgeoning strength of will, the fortress, with its unyielding walls. Mirrored her resolve a place of harsh refuge where survival was etched in every stone, to evoke the era's medical limitations. Recall that childbirth was a gamble with fate, guided by herbal lore, and prayer rather than science, where a misplaced infant could spell doom. Carleon's arsenal included poultices and astrological charts, but against nature's misalignment, they were frail weapons. As the dark winter days blurred into one another, Margaret adapted to Pembroke's rhythms, finding solace in the distant roar of the sea and the flickering hearth fires. The castle's isolation was both curse and blessing, shielding her from the chaos brewing in England while confining her to a world of waiting and worry. Here, in this edge-of-the-world stronghold, she would face the ultimate trial, her young body a battleground for dynasty and destiny. As Margaret's pregnancy advanced through the interminable winter months at Pembroke Castle, she exhibited a maturity that far exceeded her tender years, channeling her fears and isolation into pursuits that would fortify her for the trials ahead. Confined to her chambers by the relentless storms and her own waning strength, she immersed herself in the study of politics and statecraft, recognizing instinctively that knowledge would be her most potent armor in the treacherous world unfolding beyond the castle walls. Jasper Tudor, impressed by her keen intellect and unyielding determination, assumed the role of her tutor in these arts of survival. By the fire's glow, as winds howled like banshees outside, he schooled her in the subtle cues of human behavior, how to decipher the flicker of an eye or the hesitation in a voice that betrayed hidden motives. He unraveled the intricate web of alliances and enmities that ensnared the nobility, drawing maps on parchment of familial ties, rival claims, and shifting loyalties in the brewing conflict between Lancaster and York. These lessons were not mere abstractions. They were lifelines in an era where a misplaced trust could lead to the scaffold. Jasper shared tales from his own experiences at court, where Henry VI's frailty had allowed factions to flourish like weeds in untended soil. He taught Margaret to parse diplomatic language, to hear the unspoken threats laced within flowery compliments, and to anticipate betrayals before they struck. Her mind, sharp as a Welsh blade, absorbed it all, transforming her from a frightened girl into a nascent strategist. This education extended to the practicalities of power, understanding taxation, military levies, and the management of estates, skills typically reserved for men, are essential for a widow who might one day command her own fortunes. In these sessions, Jasper saw echoes of his brother's ambition in her, a spark that he nurtured carefully, knowing the child she carried could redefine their family's destiny. Parallel to this worldly instruction, Margaret plunged into religious studies with a fervor that alarmed even her attendants, spending hours in the castle's chapel until her knees were raw and bruised from the unyielding stone. The altar, adorned with a silver crucifix and relics of local saints, became her sanctuary, where she memorized Latin prayers and pored over theological texts illuminated by candlelight that danced like divine whispers. Father Meredith, the castle's priest, a Welshman educated at Cambridge, blending classical scholarship with the pragmatic wisdom of a turbulent age, emerged as a pivotal figure in her spiritual formation. He guided her through the works of Augustine and Aquinas, emphasizing that faith was not passive surrender, but active engagement. Prayer without deeds was hollow. Yet action infused with devotion could topple empires. Meredith's teachings resonated deeply, framing her suffering as a crucible ordained by God, much like the trials of biblical heroines such as Esther or Judith, who wielded influence in male-dominated realms. Historians speculate that this intense religiosity served as a bulwark against the traumas she had endured: the abrupt marriage, the violation of her wedding night, and the looming terror of childbirth. It imposed meaning on chaos, transforming raw pain into a narrative of divine purpose, a coping mechanism that armored her psyche against despair. In the chapel's dim confines, scented with incense and beeswax, Margaret developed a personal communion with the divine that bordered on the mystical, vowing her life to God's service in exchange for the safe delivery of her child. Father Meredith, sensing her vulnerability, tempered her zeal with counsel on balance, warning against the pitfalls of fanaticism that had ensnared others in heresy or madness. He introduced her to Welsh spiritual traditions, tales of Celtic saints who found God in nature's wild beauty, offering a gentler counterpoint to the rigid doctrines of the Church. These dual educations, political from Jasper, spiritual from Meredith, wove together to build Margaret's resilience, forging a character of iron will cloaked in piety. As her belly swelled and the baby's kicks grew stronger, she practiced these lessons in small ways, negotiating with servants over household matters too. Hone her persuasion, or analyzing visitors' demeanors for signs of deceit. The trauma of her experiences manifested in quiet ways, flinching at sudden touches. Nightmares that left her gasping in the night, but she channeled them into purpose, viewing her ordeals as tests that would prepare her for greater roles. Pembroke's isolation amplified this introspection, the castle's ancient stones seeming to whisper secrets of entrance from centuries past. In this crucible of waiting, Margaret Beaufort was not merely surviving, she was evolving, her spirit hardening like steel in a forge, ready to face the agony that January would bring in the tumultuous decades beyond. On a bitter January night in 1457, the fragile calm of Pembroke Castle shattered as Margaret Beaufort's labour began with a ferocity that seemed to rend her very soul. She had been pacing the battlements earlier that day, bundled in furs against the icy wind, as Dr. Lewis Carlion insisted fresh air might ease her discomfort. The first contraction struck like a thunderbolt, a crushing, tearing pain that doubled her over, her hands clutching the rough stone for support. Her attending ladies, their faces pale with alarm, rushed her back to her chambers, where the air grew thick with urgency and dread. The midwives, led by Dame Gwenllian Ferch, a woman whose weathered hands had delivered babies for 3 decades, prepared the room with grim efficiency. They stoked the fire to a raw hung linen sheets to shield Margaret from drafts and laid out there instruments, knives for cutting the cord, forceps for dire emergencies, and relics of St. Margaret of Antioch, whose intercession they invoked with fervent prayers. For 18 hours, Margaret endured an agony that defied description, her screams echoing off the stone walls until her voice broke, leaving only raw, gasping moans. The midwives worked tirelessly, their hands slick with blood and sweat, as they tried to guide the child into the world. Dame Gwenllian, whose knowledge was inherited through generations of Welsh women, employed every technique in her arsenal, massages to shift the baby's position, herbal infusions of lavender and rosemary to calm and strengthen, whispered encouragements in Margaret's ear to keep her fighting. But the prognosis was bleak. The baby, large and awkwardly positioned, pressed against a pelvis to narrow for a safe passage. Margaret's youth made every effort perilous, her body still forming, strained under a burden that had killed women twice her age. The chamber filled with the acrid smoke of burning herbs, meant to ward off evil spirits and bolster courage. But it did little to mask the scent of fear that permeated the air. Jasper Tudor paced the corridors outside, his boots ringing against the flagstones, each of Margaret's cries slicing through him like a blade. Servants darted past with steaming basins and fresh linens, their eyes reflecting the gravity of the moment. Father Meredith knelt in the chapel below, his prayers a ceaseless litany for the girl whose life hung by a thread. As the hours bled into dawn, Margaret's strength began to falter. Her pulse grew thready, her skin pale as the snow outside, and internal bleeding signaled a crisis. Dr. Carlion, summoned from a fitful sleep, conferred urgently with Dame Gwenllian in whispers that carried the weight of life or death decisions. The baby's heartbeat was irregular, a faint drumbeat of distress, and the time for waiting had run out. They resolved to attempt a manual extraction, a desperate, dangerous procedure that might save the child at the cost of the mother's life. Dame Gwenllian positioned Margaret carefully, her hands steady despite the stakes, murmuring prayers to St. Margaret as she prepared to reach inside. The technique, rarely attempted on one so young, required precision and a courage born of experience. The room held its breath. The only sounds the crackle of the hearth and Margaret's laboured gasps. Every person present knew the odds. Many such births ended in tragedy, the mother's body torn beyond repair, the child stillborn or too weak to survive. Yet Gwenllian's skill, honed over decades, was their only hope. The procedure was a battle against nature itself, a race to preserve to lives teetering on the edge of oblivion. To deepen the scene's intensity, consider the era's brutal reality. Childbirth was a leading cause of death, with no anesthesia, no sterile tools, only the midwife's lore and God's mercy. Margaret, caught in this crucible, was no longer a girl but a vessel for a dynasty, her pain the price of a future king. In a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the baby finally emerged from Margaret Beaufort's tormented body, a culmination of suffering that had pushed both to the precipice of death. The midwives held their collective breath as Dame Gwenllian deaf-eyed lifted the infant, pale and slick with blood and vernix, its tiny chest still for a heart-stopping instant. The chamber fell silent save for Margaret's ragged breathing and the fire's insistent crackle, the weight of uncertainty hanging like a shroud. Then, with a swift motion, Gwenllian cleared the baby's mouth and throat, and a thin, indignant wail pierced the era-defiant announcement of life that echoed through the stone halls of Pembroke Castle. It was January 28, 1457, and Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII of England, had ended the world against all odds. His first cry a harbinger of the dynasty he would found. Margaret, barely clinging to consciousness, her vision blurred by exhaustion and pain, heard that sound through a haze as profound as any battlefield fog. She reached out weakly, her fingers trembling, but her arms refused to obey. Collapsing limp at her sides, Dame Gwenllian, with a tenderness belying the ordeal, placed the newborn briefly on his mother's chest, allowing that sacred first contact a moment of raw connection amid the chaos. Margaret's eyes, heavy-lidded but fierce, fixed on her son's wrinkled face, memorizing the curve of his nose, the tuft of dark hair, the miniature hands flailing in protest. The baby was robust despite the trauma, his lungs strong as he protested the cold world. But the delivery had exacted a terrible toll. The midwives moved quickly now, wrapping him in swaddled linens warmed by the fire, while others tended to Margaret, staunching the flow of blood and assessing the damage. The tension in the room eased fractionally as word spread both mother and child lived. Jasper Tudor, bursting through the door at the sound of the cry, his face etched with relief, knelt briefly by the bed to offer a prayer of thanks. Father Meredith's chants from the chapel below swelled in volume, a Te Deum of gratitude resounding through the castle. Servants lit additional candles, their flames dancing like celebratory spirits. As the storm outside began to abate, the wind's howl softening to a murmur, Henry was cleaned and examined. His vital signs strong, a miracle in an age where infant mortality claimed half of all births, especially those as fraught as this. The midwives attributed his survival to divine intervention and Gwenllian's expertise, her hands guided by ancestral wisdom that blended herbal remedies with unyielding resolve. To capture the profound surprise of this outcome, recall that in 15th century England, such a birth was statistically improbable. Young mothers often perished, their babies following suit. Henry's rival not only preserved the Tudor line, but symbolized resilience in a fractured kingdom, where the Lancastrian cause desperately needed symbols of hope. Margaret, drifting in and out of awareness, felt a surge of maternal love mingled with the fog of pain, her son's cry anchoring her to life. As the first light of dawn filtered through the iced windows, casting a pale glow on the scene, the castle stirred with quiet jubilation. The future king, unaware of his destiny, nursed at a wet nurse's breast, while his mother began the long road to recovery. Her body broken, but her spirit ignited by the life she had wrought. The physical toll of Henry Tudor's birth on Margaret Beaufort was catastrophic and irrevocable, a savage assault on her young body that left scars both visible and hidden. Ensuring she would never bear another child, Dr. Lewis Carlion, in the hazy days following the delivery, conducted examinations that revealed extensive tearing of flesh and damage to internal organs, injuries that bled profusely and invited infection in an age before antiseptics. Her pelvis, fractured under the strain, would ache for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the night she had been pushed beyond human limits. At just 13, her reproductive years were abruptly terminated, her womb rendered barren by the very act that fulfilled dynastic expectations, a cruel irony in a society that measured a woman as worth by age. Her fertility, the physician whispered of torn ligaments and displaced bones, of blood loss that had drained her to the brink of death, leaving her skin ashen and her pulse a faint flutter. Recovery was a protracted battle, with Margaret teetering between life and oblivion for weeks, her body racked by fevers that burned like hellfire and chills that shook her like autumn leaves. Dr. Carlion deployed every remedy in his arsenal, bloodletting to restore the balance of humours, poultices of healing herbs like comfrey, and yarrow to combat inflammation, and fortified wine steeped with medicinal roots to rebuild her strength. Dame Gwenllian Dafydd remained a constant vigil at her bedside, spooning nutrient-rich broths past cracked lips and monitoring every shift in her condition with the intuition of a seasoned healer. The midwife's hands, which had pulled Henry into the world, now applied salves to wounds that wept and festered, her Welsh incantations blending with Latin prayers to invoke healing from both folk tradition and divine grace. Servants changed linens soaked with sweat and pus, the chamber air heavy with the scent of vinegar washes used to ward off miasma. Yet the psychological wounds cut even deeper, manifesting in ways that no herb or prayer could fully mend. Nightmares plagued her sleep, vivid terrors where she relived the labor's agony, her screams silent in the dream, but waking her in cold sweats that left her trembling. She flinched from even the gentlest touches, her body recoiling as if every contact threatened fresh violation, a residue of the traumas layered upon her child marriage, forced consummation. And now this brutal birth. Her bond with newborn Henry became a tangled web of love and aversion. She adored him with a fierce protective intensity, yet holding him triggered floods of memory, the warmth of his tiny form evoking the pain that had birthed him. In quiet moments, she would gaze at him from afar, her eyes filling with tears, whispering promises of a future she would forge for him, even as proximity stirred unease. This complex maternal relationship unfolded in the dim light of Pembroke's nursery, where a wet nurse tended to Henry's needs while Margaret observed, her heart aching with frustration. Historians suggest these reactions stemmed from the year's unacknowledged post-traumatic stress, where women endured without the language to name their suffering. Turning instead to piety for solace, Margaret's devotion intensified, her prayers a lifeline that imposed order on chaos. Viewing her baroness as goddess will a cross to bear that redirected her energies towards spiritual and political ray. Jasper Tudor, witnessing her struggles, offered gentle support, ranging for Father Meredith to counsel her on forgiveness and purpose, framing her ordeals as a divine forging of strength. Through it all, Margaret's spirit refused to shatter, emerging from the haze of recovery with a resolve tempered by fire. The physical limitations became fuel for her intellect, her inability to bear more children shifting her focus to safeguarding the one she had, planting the seeds of the formidable woman who would navigate England's bloodiest conflicts. In the echoing halls of Pembroke, as winter yielded to tentative spring, she began to reclaim her agency, her broken body a testament to sacrifice, her mending psyche a forge for ambition. Though Margaret Beaufort's body bore the permanent marks of her ordeal, her spirit emerged unbowed, a resilient force that would propel her into the annals of history as one of England's most influential women. In the slow months of recovery at Pembroke Castle, as she regained strength amid the blooming Welsh spring, she displayed an iron will and shrewd intelligence that belied her youth. She grasped, even in her weakened state, that her son Henry represented the flickering hope of the Lancastrian cause, a potential heir whose Beaufort blood linked him to the throne through John of Gaunt's line. In a kingdom where the wars of the Roses were igniting with ferocious intensity, a landless widow with an infant son was perilously vulnerable, easy prey for ambitious nobles or Yorkist enforcers. Margaret understood that survival demanded protection. Alliances forged not from sentiment but from strategic necessity. Her solution materialized in marriage once more, a pragmatic step in a world where women navigated power through matrimonial bonds. In 1458, scarcely recovered from Henry's birth, she wed Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the Duke of Buckingham, in a subdued ceremony that contrasted sharply with the grandeur of her union to Edmund Tudor. The event was intimate, held at one of the Stafford estates, with only close kin and trusted allies in attendance, no lavish feasts or tournaments. Just solemn vows exchanged in a chapel adorned with simple wildflowers. Stafford, a man in his 20s with Yorkist leanings, but a pragmatic bent, offered the shield she needed, military might from his family's forces and political cover through their influence at court. For Margaret, the match secured her estates and safeguarded Henry, even if it meant sharing a bed with a husband whose allegiances clashed with her deep-seated Lancastrian convictions. The marriage contract, meticulously negotiated by Margaret's mother and Stafford's father, was a masterpiece of detail, reflecting the era's volatile politics. Margaret retained control over her Beaufort lands, ensuring Henry's inheritance remained intact, while Stafford pledged protection and discretion regarding her family's sympathies. Crucially, young Henry would stay under Jasper Tudor's guardianship in Wales, a clause that likely preserved his life amid the escalating chaos. This union lasted 14 years, spanning some of the bloodiest chapters in English history, during which Margaret honed her skills in diplomacy and subterfuge. She watched from the shadows as kings rose and fell. Henry VI deposed, Edward IV crowned, then Henry briefly restored before Edward's final triumph. Each shift brought fresh dangers for those with divided loyalties, and Margaret learned to tread these treacherous waters with grace, cultivating ties across factions while concealing her true aims. To amplify the emotional undercurrents, envision Margaret on her wedding day, her body still frail, her eyes shadowed by recent suffering, yet burning with resolve. The vows she spoke were laced with calculation, a far cry from the naive promises of her first marriage. Stafford, though not unkind, was a stranger chosen for utility, their relationship evolving into a business-like partnership rather than passionate bond. This arrangement allowed Margaret to channel her frustrated maternal instincts into letters and gifts sent covertly to Henry, small tokens bridging the distance imposed by safety. Amid the Wars of the Roses, where brother turned against brother and alliances crumbled like autumn leaves, her marriage provided a veneer of neutrality, masking the fierce Lancastrian fire within. As battles raged and the realm bled, Margaret Beaufort transformed personal sacrifice into political acumen. Her iron willed the fort that would one day crown her son. The Wars of the Roses erupted round Margaret Beaufort like a storm long brewing, a cataclysmic clash between the houses of Lancaster and York that would drench England in blood for 3 decades. This civil strife, named for the red rose emblem of Lancaster and the white of York, stemmed from competing claims to the throne, both tracing back to Edward III's sons. The Lancastrians, including Margaret through her Beaufort lineage, descended from John of Gaunt, the 4th son, while the Yorkists boasted a line from the 2nd son, Lionel of Antwerp, bolstered by inheritance through the female line. At the heart of the conflict stood King Henry VI, a Lancastrian monarch whose piety masked a profound weakness, perhaps madness, that rendered him unfit to rule a fractious realm, his queen. Margaret of Anjou, a fierce Frenchwoman, shouldered the burden of governance but earned hatred for her foreign origins and the military, debacles in France that she was unfairly blamed for accelerating. The first sparks flew at the Battle of First St. Albans in 1455, a chaotic skirmish in the streets of that Hertfordshire town where Yorkist forces under Richard, Duke of York, ambushed the royal army, killing key Lancastrian lords and capturing the king himself. This encounter, though small in scale, signalled that disputes would be settled not in Parliament but on the battlefield, with sword and axe. Margaret Beaufort, newly married to Edmund Tudor at the time, felt the ripples as alliances fractured and old friends became foes. The violence escalated. Dramatically at Towton in 1461, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. On a snow-swept Palm Sunday in Yorkshire, nearly 50,000 men clashed in a maelstrom of steel and fury, leaving half dead by dusk the Lancastrian cause in tatters, Henry VI fleeing to Scotland, and his queen sailing to France with their son, Edward of Westminster. Edward IV, the tall, charismatic Yorkist claimant, ascended the throne, his victory at Towton a testament to the era's brutality, where rivers ran red and bodies piled like cordwood. Amid these shifting fortunes, Margaret navigated the perilous landscape with cunning, leveraging networks of women whose bonds often outlasted the fleeting loyalties of men. She cultivated relationships across divides, understanding that ladies of the court exchanged more than embroidery patterns. They traded secrets, favors, and influence. Her correspondence with Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's queen and a former Lancastrian and widow who had ensnared the king with her beauty and wit, was a masterclass in diplomacy. These letters, ostensibly about household matters or religious devotions, veiled discussions of political undercurrents, forging a subtle alliance that could sway royal policy. Similarly, Margaret maintained clandestine communications with Margaret of Anjou in her French exile, offering counsel and intelligence that kept the exiled queen's hopes alive. Such epistles required exquisite care. A single intercepted word could brand her a traitor, leading to the block, to heightened intrigue. Consider the cultural role of women in this male-dominated war, often sidelined from battlefields. They wielded power through salons, marriages, and whispered confidences. Their networks a web of resilience amid chaos. Margaret's piety served as camouflage, her pilgrimages and charitable acts providing cover for meetings with sympathizers, as battles like Wakefield in 1460, where York himself perished, his head mockingly crowned with paper, or the Yorkist triumph at Mortimer's Cross, amplified the Carnage, she adapted, her marriage to Stafford offering a Yorkist facade while her heart remained Lancastrian. These female alliances, forged in drawing rooms and chapels, proved invaluable, allowing her to anticipate shifts in power and protect her distant son, turning personal connections into lifelines in a realm torn asunder. Throughout the turbulent years of her marriage to Henry Stafford, Margaret Beaufort's son, Henry Tudor, grew up in the rugged hills of Wales under the watchful guardianship of his uncle, Jasper Tudor. This arrangement, born of necessity in a realm fractured by war, kept the boy safe from Yorkist clutches, but exacted a heavy emotional toll on his mother. Henry, separated from Margaret since infancy, was raised in Pembroke Castle and other Welsh strongholds, where Jasper ensured he received an education befitting a potential heir though one shrouded in exile-like isolation. The boy learned to ride across misty moors, wield a sword with precision, and master the arts of music and dance that polished noble youths. More crucially, Jasper instilled practical skills for survival, fluency in Welsh to command local loyalty, an understanding of royal rhythms that bound lord to tenant, and the command of men through respect rather than fear. These lessons drawn from Jasper's own experiences as a Lancastrian fugitive sheet Henry into a resilient figure, grounded in the traditions of a land that viewed the Tudors as native sons, their Welsh heritage a badge of defiance against English dominance. For Margaret, the separation was a wound that never healed, a constant ache sharpened by the uncertainty of war. She saw her son perhaps once or twice a year, under tightly controlled conditions, each visit a fleeting moment of joy tinged with dread. Letters became her lifeline, carefully coded missives that navigated enemy lines, disguised as mundane correspondence about trade or family matters. Hidden within were messages of love, advice, and news, written in invisible ink or cipher to evade Yorkist spies. She sent gifts when possible, books of poetry, finely woven tunics, a carved wooden horse, small tokens to remind Henry of a mother he barely knew, the fear that he might fall ill, be captured, or simply forget her haunted her nights, turning her prayers into pleas for his safety. In her chambers, she kept a small chest of his infant garments, their faint scent to tell her to memories of holding him in Pembroke's nursery, a time already fading into myth. Meanwhile, Margaret's own education flourished under the necessities of her position. As the wife of Henry Stafford, she managed vast Beaufort estates, mastering the intricacies of ledgers, rents, and legal disputes with a scholar's zeal. Her library grew into one of England's finest, filled with illuminated manuscripts in Latin, French, and English, covering law, history, and theology subjects she devoured with an intensity that rivaled university clerics. She studied the Magna Carta and canon law, learning to draft contracts that protected her interests, and pored over chronicles of England's kings, gleaning lessons from their triumphs and failures. Her theological studies deepened, blending mysticism with practical faith, as she sought divine guidance for the political chessboard she navigated. This intellectual rigor, rare for women of her time, armed her with tools to wield influence in a male-dominated world, her mind a fortress as unyielding as Pembroke's walls. To evoke the era's gendered constraints, consider how Margaret's role as a state manager defied norms, where noble women were expected to embroider and pray, not negotiate with tenants or challenge crop stewards. Her letters to Henry, smuggled through merchants or pilgrims, were acts of defiance, each word a risk of treason. The emotional strain of separation fueled her ambition, transforming maternal love into a fierce determination to secure Henry's future. As the wars of the Roses raged with battles like Wakefield and Towton reshaping the realm, Margaret balanced her public deference to Stafford's Yorkist ties with private loyalty to her son's Lancastrian claim, her heart a divided kingdom sustained by hope and cunning. The political kaleidoscope of England shifted once more in 1469, a year that brought fresh wounds and unexpected opportunities to Margaret Beaufort's carefully balanced world. At the Battle of Edgecote Moor, fought amid the rolling hills of Northamptonshire on a sweltering July day, her husband Henry Stafford suffered a grievous injury while fighting for the Yorkist king, Edward IV. The clash was a chaotic melee sparked by the Earl of Warwick's rebellion against his former ally, Edward, whom he had helped crown. Stafford, loyal to the Yorkist cause despite his wife's Lancastrian blood, charged into the fray, only to be felled by a deep gash to his thigh from a Poley axe-wing. The wound festered in the summer heat, infection setting in with a vengeance that left him bedridden and partially lame, his once robust frame weakened and his spirit embittered by the lack of royal recognition for his sacrifice. Margaret nursed him through months of agonizing recovery, her hands applying poultices and changing bandages, all while subtly weaving threads of doubt into his mind. She never overtly championed the Lancastrian side that would have been suicidal folly, but instead planted seeds of discontent, tales of Edward's extravagance, and favoritism toward the Woodville family. Whispers of corruption at court that rewarded sycophants over true warriors. Stafford, racked by pain and resentment, proved fertile ground. His injury had not only scarred his body, but cracked his allegiance, making him receptive to Margaret's nuanced influence. She drew on her growing psychological acumen, repeating stories of Yorkist injustices with patient repetition, exploiting his wounded pride until, by 1470, he was ready to pivot. This gradual shift was a testament to Margaret's mastery of persuasion, honed through years of navigating divided loyalties, turning a personal crisis into a political advantage. The year 1470 brought a stunning reversal, orchestrated by the Earl of Warwick, the infamous kingmaker whose pride had turned him against Edward IV. In a bizarre alliance, Warwick joined forces with Margaret of Anjou, the exiled Lancastrian queen he had once battled, to restore Henry VI to the throne. Politics made for the strangest bedfellows, and Warwick's fleet sailed from France with Anjou's blessing, landing in England to rally disaffected nobles. Edward IV fled to Burgundy, his brother Richard of Gloucester at his side, while Henry VI was paraded from the Tower of London bewildered and frail, his mind shattered by years of imprisonment and reinstalled as king in October. The readaptation, as it became known, seemed a miracle to Lancastrian faithful like Margaret. She attended the restoration ceremony at Westminster Abbey, witnessing the mad king's confusion firsthand, his vacant eyes a poignant symbol of the cause's fragility. For a brief, intoxicating moment, hope surged. Perhaps her son Henry could return from Welsh seclusion, his claim bolstered by a resurgent Lancaster. Margaret seized the opportunity with fervent energy, cautiously reaching out to fellow sympathizers to gauge support for an uprising. Her communications were veiled in code, passed through trusted intermediaries like merchants or clergy, each word a potential death sentence if discovered. The restoration ignited celebrations in Lancastrian strongholds, bonfires blazing against the autumn night. But Margaret tempered her optimism with caution, knowing Warwick's ambitions could fracture the fragile coalition, yet the reprieve was fleeting. Edward IV returned from exile in March 1471, backed by Burgundy and gold, and a cadre of mercenaries, swiftly gathering forces from nobles weary of endless upheaval. The decisive blows fell in rapid succession at Barnet on April 14, 1471. Amid a thick fog that turned the battlefield into a ghostly arena, Warwick's army clashed with Edward's. Betrayal and confusion reigned. Warwick's own men mistook allies for foes in the murk, leading to slaughter. The kingmaker fell in the melee, his body stripped and displayed as a trophy. 2 weeks later, on May 4th, at Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire, the Lancastrian remnants faced annihilation. Margaret of Anjou's son, Edward of Westminster, the last direct heir, perished in the fighting. The rumors persisted of murder after capture. His body hacked in cold blood. Henry VI himself vanished shortly after, likely smothered in the Tower on Edward's orders, his death shrouded in the euphemism of melancholy. These defeats crushed the Lancastrian cause, leaving a vacuum where Margaret's son suddenly loomed as the most viable claimant. His Beaufort lineage a distant but potent thread. The battle's savagery, Barnet's fog-shrouded chaos claiming thousands, Tewkesbury's rout by the River Severn where fleeing soldiers drowned in droves underscored the war's merciless toll. Margaret, receiving news in hushed reports, felt the ground shift beneath her, her careful maneuvers appended. Stafford's newfound sympathies, cultivated so painstakingly, now placed them in greater peril as Edward consolidated power with ruthless efficiency. In the aftermath, as Yorkist banners flew unchallenged, Margaret's resolve hardened further, her gaze turning toward exile and long-term stratagems to reclaim what had been lost. To deepen the narrative's emotional grip, imagine Margaret in her solar. Maps of battlefields spread before her, tracing the lines of defeat with a trembling finger. The Restoration's brief light had illuminated possibilities, only for Barnet and Tewkesbury to plunge her into deeper shadow. Stafford, still limping from his wound, shared her vigil, his shift complete a personal victory amid national catastrophe. These shifts not only altered England's throne, but reshaped Margaret's path, forcing her to adapt. With the cunning of a survivor, the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471 marked the irrevocable death knell for the direct Lancastrian line, plunging England into a new era of Yorkist dominance and thrusting Margaret Beaufort's son into unprecedented danger, with the slaying of Edward, Prince of Wales' Anjou's son, and Henry VI's eremit. The muddy fields by the River Severn, and the subsequent mysterious demise of the king himself in the Tower, the Lancastrian succession evaporated like mist under a harsh sun. Suddenly, 14-year-old Henry Tudor emerged as the most credible claimant through his mother's Beaufort blood, a lineage tainted by questions of legitimacy from generations past, but now a beacon for any who opposed Edward IV's rule. His claim was tenuous, weaving through female lines and bastardy absolved by papal decree. Yet in the void left by slaughter, it gained a perilous significance. Jasper Tudor, ever the vigilant guardian, recognized the immediate threat. Yorkist agents would not hesitate to eliminate a boy who could. Rallied the disaffected, in a desperate bid for survival, Jasper orchestrated Henry's exile to Brittany, a duchy caught in the vice between France and England, ruled by Duke Francis II, who viewed the Tudor heir as a valuable pawn. On a tempestuous night in September 1471, Henry boarded a ship at Tenby harbour, the waves crashing like omens as Yorkist forces closed in on Pembroke. The departure was frantic, with barely an hour's warning, Jasper bundling his nephew aboard amid howling winds and drenching rain. Henry, torn from the only home he knew, gazed back at the receding Welsh cliffs, his young heart heavy with confusion and loss. The exile would stretch to 14 years, a formative odyssey that honed his caution and resilience. But for Margaret, absent from the scene, the news arrived like a dagger. Days later, in the quiet of her English manor, she learned of her son's flight across the Channel. The separation now vast and potentially eternal. The shock buckled her, yet it forged her resolve, transmuting grief into a cold and yielding ambition to orchestrate his return. Compounding this anguish, Henry Stafford died later that year, his passing suspiciously timed amid his shifting loyalties and lingering war wounds. Whether natural decline, poison from rivals sensing his wavering, or the cumulative stress of betrayal and battle claimed him remains veiled in history's shadows. At 30, Margaret was twice widowed, her position precarious, but Stafford's death liberated her to pursue bolder paths. Facing a crossroads, she eschewed a safe, obscure match for one steeped in power. Her third marriage to Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, a consummate survivor whose family commanded formidable forces in northwest England. Stanley was a maestro of political equivocation, switching sides with exquisite timing to always emerge victorious, his networks spanning court, merchants and clergy. The wedding in 1472 was a spectacle calibrated to affirm Margaret's enduring clout. 3 days of tournaments, banquets, and masses drawing nobles from across the realm. Even Edward IV attended, perhaps preferring to monitor this dangerous woman up close. The contract was labyrinthine, safeguarding Margaret's estates and right to advance Henry's interests. While Stanley gained prestige from her royal blood, their union was a calculated symbiosis, devoid of romance, but rich in mutual benefit, her intelligence complementing his opportunism. Together, they weathered Edward's final years, surviving intrigues that fell peers, with Margaret leveraging Stanley's cover to sustain ties with exiles and plotters. This marriage elevated Margaret's game, granting access to intelligence that could tip battles. A Beaufort tenacity paired with Stanley's cunning, a force that would culminate at Bosworth. In Brittany, Henry adapted to courtly exile, but Margaret's constant fear of assassins, plague, or oblivion drove her ceaseless vigilance. The aftermath of Tewkesbury had not broken her. It had recast her as a strategist supreme, her sacrifices fueling a dynasty's dawn. In the Duchy of Brittany, where the rocky coasts met the churning Atlantic, Henry Tudor spent his formative years in a precarious exile that shaped him into a cautious, introspective young man. Arriving in 1471 at the age of 14, he and Jasper were initially treated as honored guests by Duke Francis II, whose independent realm served as a buffer between the rival powers of France and England. Henry's life there was one of enforced idleness interspersed with bursts of courtly education. He resided in various chateaux, from the imposing fortress of Cecina to the more refined halls of Vannes, where he honed his skills in languages, diplomacy, and the arts of war. Brittany's Celtic heritage resonated with his world truths, and he absorbed the local Breton tongue alongside French, building alliances with nobles who viewed him as a symbol of resistance against larger kingdoms. Yet his position was fragile, a bargaining chip in Francis's negotiations with Edward IV, who repeatedly demanded his extradition. Henry's days were marked by constant vigilance, his movements restricted, his correspondence scrutinized, fostering a wariness that would define his kingship. Meanwhile, back in England, Margaret Beaufort constructed an intelligence network of astonishing breadth and sophistication, a web of informants that spanned palaces, merchant guilds, monastic houses, and noble households across the realm and beyond. She recruited servants who overheard court whispers, pilgrims who carried messages disguised as relics, and diplomats whose reports she intercepted through bribes. This system allowed her to track troop movements before commanders received orders, gauge the health of key figures like Edward IV, and monitor the loyalties of potential allies. Communications with Henry grew even more sporadic and elaborate, employing false names, invisible inks made from lemon juice or gallnut extracts, and ciphers based on shared books like the Bible or classical texts. Messages hid within innocuous letters about cloth shipments or harvest yields, a single misplaced word capable of dooming them both. The process was arduous, reliant on chains of trusted couriers who risked execution for treason. But it sustained the vital link between Margaret's English machinations and Henry's Breton. Caught in exile, Margaret lived in perpetual dread that her son had perished felled by an assassin's blade dispatched from Yorkist shadows, claimed by the fevers that ravaged medieval Europe, or lost to some nameless accident in a foreign land. The uncertainty, no deeper than confirmed tragedy might have, prompting her to devise redundant systems of verification, multiple informants cross-checking news from Brittany, Codes within codes to authenticate letters, her transformation during these years was profound. The pious, grieving widow evolved into a master strategist. Her mind a labyrinth of contingencies and long-term plots. She analyzed every scrap of information like a general poring over maps, predicting Edward IV's policies and exploiting fissures in his rule. Her marriage to Stanley provided impeccable cover. His ambiguous loyalties allowing her to operate in the open while concealing her true intent. Courtiers who once saw her as a quiet devotee now encountered a woman who anticipated moves like a chess grandmaster. Her conversations laced with subtle probes that revealed more than they asked. To illuminate the cultural context, consider the era's espionage as a shadowy art form, where women like Margaret wielded influence through indirect means. Their networks often more enduring than overt power structures, her library expanded with treatises on cryptography and military strategy, including works by Caesar and Vegetius. Blending ancient wisdom with contemporary intrigue, the constant fears manifested in her intensified religiosity, endowing churches and founding chantries as votive offerings for Henry's safety, her prayers a blend of supplication and resolve. This period forged Margaret's legend as the Lady of the Red Rose, a figure whose maternal love transmogrified into political alchemy, patiently eroding Yorkist foundations while nurturing Lancastrian embers. As the 1470s wore on, Henry's exile deepened his character. He formed bonds with fellow exiles, learned the intricacies of European politics, and dreamed of a return that seemed ever distant. Margaret's coded missives arrived like lifelines, urging patience and preparation. Her words a beacon in his isolation. The not knowing tormented her, but it also sharpened her edge, turning a mother's anxiety into a force that would reshape history. In this dance of shadows, across the Channel's divide, mother and son plotted in unison, their separation a crucible for the Tudor triumph to come. The unexpected death of Edward IV in April 1483 at the age of 40 threw the kingdom into immediate turmoil. His passing a sudden jolt that exposed the fragility of Yorkist rule. The king, who had lived indulgently with feasts and mistresses that hastened his decline, left behind a 12-year-old heir, Edward V, whose minority promised a regency ripe for manipulation. But the boy king would never wear the crown. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's loyal brother, a battle-hardened warrior with a reputation for piety and ruthlessness, seized power in a swift coup that stunned the nobility, proclaiming himself protector. Richard arrested key Woodville relatives, Edward IV's in-laws, on charges of treason, then declared the young king and his brother illegitimate based on a dubious claim of their parents' invalid marriage. The princes were confined to the Tower of London, ostensibly for safety, but they vanished from public view. Their fate a dark mystery that fueled whispers of murder, perhaps smothered in their sleepwalk. Drowned in Malmsey wine, as later tales suggested, Richard III was crowned in July 1483, his reign shadowed by suspicion of infanticide, eroding his legitimacy and fracturing Yorkist unity from Margaret Beaufort. This usurpation was a double-edged sword, grave peril mingled with golden opportunity. Richard's seizure of the throne demolished Yorkist moral authority, positioning her son's distant Lancastrian claim as a compelling alternative to a king tainted by child-killing rumors. With breathtaking audacity, Margaret plunged into conspiracy, collaborating with Bishop John Morton, a shrewd cleric imprisoned by Richard but escaped to join her network and other disaffected nobles. She coordinated an intricate rebellion from within England while ranging Henry's invasion from Brittany, securing funds through covert loans from merchants and exiles, and sensing timetables across stormy seas. The plot demanded flawless execution, uprisings in the south to distract Richard's forces, Henry's landing with Breton mercenaries, and defections from key lords disillusioned by the prince's disappearance. Margaret's intelligence web hummed with activity, coded letters flying like arrows. Her Stanley marriage providing a veneer of loyalty while she wove treason in the shadows. The rebellion ignited in October 1483 but collapsed under betrayal and misfortune. Buckingham, Margaret's ally and Stafford's kin, rose in the west but was thwarted by floods that swelled rivers into barriers, his army dissolving in the deluge. Henry sailed from Brittany, but storms scattered his fleet, forcing a retreat without landing. Richard's spies unraveled the threads, executing conspirators with grim efficiency. Buckingham beheaded in Salisbury marketplace, his blood staining the cobbles. Margaret watched in horror as her comrade fell, escaping the axe only through Stanley's intercession and her own gender, which spared her the traitor's death. Instead, Richard stripped her of titles and lands, placing her under house arrest at Stanley's Latham House, her movements curtailed, her correspondence monitored. Yet, even in confinement, Margaret's spirit burned undimmed. She continued scheming through loyal servants and veiled messages, her mind already charting paths to redemption. The failure was crushing, lives lost and hopes dashed, but it taught invaluable lessons in timing and trust, refining her strategies for the decisive confrontation ahead to intensify the drama. Envision Margaret in her guarded chambers, poring over maps by candlelight. The weight of the prince's unknown fate, a tale of innocence betrayed that echoed her own. Losses fueling her resolve. Richard's coronation, with its pomp masking paranoia, contrasted her quiet defiance, her house rest a cage from which she plotted like a spider spinning anew. The rebellion's collapse amid autumn rains symbolized the era's caprice, where weather and whispers could topple kings. But Margaret's unyielding will ensure her cause endured, a phoenix poised for rebirth. The winds of fate converged on August 22nd, 1485, at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire, where the final act of the Wars of the Roses unfolded in a clash that would crown Margaret Beaufort as lifelong lobo. As Richard III, his reign plagued by rebellion and the ghosts of the vanished princes, faced an invasion led by her son Henry Tudor, who had landed at Milford Haven earlier that month with a ragtag force of Breton mercenaries and Welsh loyalists. Henry's march through Wales swelled his ranks, drawing on ancient prophecies of a Welsh redeemer and the Tudor name's resonance in the land of dragons. Margaret, still under nominal house arrest but wielding influence through Stanley's ambiguous position, had orchestrated the pivotal betrayal. Her husband commanded a substantial army, ostensibly allied with Richard. But Margaret's years of subtle persuasion ensured his forces would turn at the crucial moment, as battle lines formed on that misty dawn, with Richard's white-bore banner fluttering against Henry's red dragon, the air thrummed with tension, the culmination of decades of her scheming. The fight was fierce but brief, Richard charging valiantly into the fray, his crown knocked from his helm in the mud. Stanley's troops, held in reserve, surged forward not to aid the king but to crush him, their betrayal sealing Richard's doom. He fell fighting, the last English king to die in battle, his body hacked and stripped, later buried unceremoniously. Henry's victory was miraculous, a testament to Margaret's intricate web, funding from exiles, intelligence that pinpointed weaknesses, and alliances forged in secrecy. At 28, after 14 years of exile and a lifetime apart from his mother, Henry VII was proclaimed on the field, the crown retrieved from a hawthorn bush and placed upon his head. The Tudor era dawned, uniting the roses in a new emblem that symbolized peace after carnage. Their reunion, after 28 years of separation, was poignant yet restrained. The simple mother-child bond forever altered by politics. Margaret arrived at court soon after, her eyes meeting Henry's in a moment laden with unspoken sacrifices, the traumas of her youth, the agonies of exile, the risks of conspiracy. She became my lady, the king's mother, the most powerful woman in England, advising on policy, arranging his marriage to Elizabeth of York to heal the divide, and witnessing the birth of their son. The future Henry VIII, her influence shaped the dynasty, endowing colleges like Christ's and St. John's at Cambridge, promoting printing through Caxton's press, and fostering humanism that bridged medieval and Renaissance worlds. Yet power came at a cost. Her relationship with Henry remained formal. Maternal affection channeled through governance rather than embraces. Margaret lived to see the Tudor rose bloom, dying in June 1509, mere months after Henry VII's passing and days following her grandson's coronation as Henry VIII. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey, crafted of black marble, bears a Latin inscription extolling her piety and wisdom, but it cannot capture the echoes of that scream in Pembroke Castle, the cry of a 13-year-old girl birthing a king amid unimaginable pain. Her life was a tapestry of suffering transmuted into triumph, body broken for dynasty. Motherhood sacrificed to ambition, personal joy subsumed by political alchemy. The Wars of the Roses ended not with a battle's clang, but a mother's unyielding will, her love a force that reshaped England. In the Welsh castle where it began, waves still crash against cliffs, winds whisper through stones. Carrying the tale of Margaret Beaufort, a girl who endured hell to fort a throne, her legacy etched in the blood and gold of history.